Hi, I'm Mike Hansen for ArtSync, and we're here in the incredible Division Gallery at Symington and Bloor area, 45 Ernest Avenue. And we're here with, I'm trying to think of how to describe her, but she's sort of the first lady of Canadian painting, contemporary Canadian painting. There'd be Emily Carr, and then there's Wanda Koop.
Oh my goodness. I don't think so, but thank you.
Oh, I do. I think you've changed the landscape of contemporary painting. Your paints, your colors are so magnificent and bold and in some ways very minimalist, but at the same time, you play so incredibly well with the landscape and what we think of or what's portrayed as Canadian painting. I see this wonderful cross in your work between the group of seven in some ways, or their idea of the landscape, and the Painter's 11, right? And that whole movement of modernism in Canada that was born in the I guess you could say the late 50s, but mainly the early 60s, right? Like I see Jack Bush in your paintings. I say the one even right behind us, the red one, reminds me of a Ray Mead.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yes, I don't know. Hopefully, you're not insulted by that. But.
Not at all. No, I'm honored that you would think that. But I also am a product of my time, and I have been watching the art produced in Canada. And interestingly, you would say Emily Carr earlier on. I became very excited about Emily and Georgia O'Keeffe when I was in art school, and I did feel that I could approach art from my painting from another perspective, that I didn't have to look to New York, that I could actually look inside myself and the world around me, and with a knowledge of art history and the history of painting in Canada, and then proceed. And
well, I think you've really captured that history here. You know, the whole notion of crossing nature and technology together, and I think that it sort of encapsulates what's happened here in Canadian art in a lot of ways, right? And I'm so glad that you've been able to take what is thought of as Canadian and made it truly your own.
Well, I think when I was younger, I was insatiable in terms of experiencing the landscape firsthand, and my partner and I at the time traveled across Canada to the north. We had a van. I would paint out in the landscape and come back when the water would freeze in the dog dish. And I would pin up work on the plywood walls of the van. And at nighttime it could be pretty dicey when it got very moist. There was a lot of humidity, and it would be like wet paint for days, and we'd be like rubbing up against paint on the side of the walls of this van. But it was all of that sort of gave me this deep knowledge, or deep love of being in an environment that I could translate into some kind of visual iconography. I remember doing a body of work in the early 80s called 9 Signs. I don't know if you're familiar with that work.
No.
But it came from my travels, and I would make notes from a fast-moving vehicle. And it would be I think at one point there were these round orbs on the side of the Trans-Canada Highway. Put your trash into orbit. Oh. Do you remember that?
No, that copy. That's a good one.
Yeah, and you know, you'd see a cut off stump, something that had been, a beautiful tree, and then a post box, painted white with a post box attached to it. And those kinds of sort of seemingly uninteresting objects in the landscape, or a telephone post, or a big heap of garbage, or a gas station, or an abandoned gas station, or a sign swinging in the distance, was all of interest to me. And so my first body of work was kind of these massive signs that were like road signs that were freestanding in the gallery, with a heap and a transformer and an incinerator and a raven. So these sort of iconographic images that were speaking of our time, and that seems to be something that's reoccurrent in my work. And the work here I see as sort of politically poetic.
Yeah. Explain that to me, what you mean by that.
Well, I did title them, and I have one called Ice Shelf, and I was flying back from the Netherlands and ended up flying through Reykjavik on Icelandic Air, and the pilot suggested we look out the left side of the aircraft to see a ice shelf the size of Manhattan floating in the North Atlantic. And when I got home, there was all kinds of news about this. And that just sat with me, and so I've done a painting that has a bit of a newsflash feel about it, but it's my imagining what it actually looked like. I mean, from the air, only an Icelandic pilot would actually tell people to look down at something white floating in the North Atlantic. But, and then the middle painting is called Home and Native Land. And it really references my earlier piece, that a number of works that I did called Native Fires, and I grew up along actually the Assiniboine and the Red River. I've sort of been equidistant from those two rivers my entire growing up, and the First Nations still make fires along the riverbanks in Winnipeg, and I've found this so profound to think that on the horizon you've got the corporate power, religious power, and political power. And then these fires that are reflecting in the river from something from the beginning of time, and so to me that's a very just the idea of that is so sort of amazing. Whether I painted it or not, conceptually it's something. So with actually with the Idle No More movement, and I'm very involved with an art center in Winnipeg, Art City, that I founded, and we have 70% First Nations. So I'm very much aware. In fact, I see Thunderbird House and a teepee from my studio, and I decided to revisit that painting that I did many years ago, and this time I made sort of fiery. I call them drips, I guess. But they're no longer fires. They're these sort of cutting through and giving a kind of sort of like maybe tears of fire.
I got you. Yeah, well, yeah. There's tears in a handful of works, in a lot of your work here.
Well, the one behind us, Spill, it's a mercurial black-blue drip, and it could be an oil spill.
Now, what I find here in the gallery is I've noticed a couple of different things from you that I hadn't seen before, especially the portraiture kind of the face paintings, which you call FaceTime, which we can, is I guess a comment on new technologies, and maybe the iPhone as an example, and you yourself carry an iPad.
Yes.
So, you know.
Well, I see those paintings as, I've been involved, I've been making paintings of masks. At one point I did a piece called Flying to the Moon, and I compared the Beijing Opera to Canadian hockey. It was in the early 80s, and everyone thought I was insane. I was like some weird guru. I kept saying China would rise. What I found so interesting about the Beijing Opera at that time was, and I did travel to China before it was open to Westerners. It was an incredible journey. But what I found so interesting, I felt that it was like, by studying these characters, it was sort of, within that opera, the characterization of the human psyche, it's like an MRI sort of sort of, I guess, revealing human character within. It seemed very evident to me. And at one point, I actually did a whole set of drawings, all the men in Maclean's magazine as Beijing Opera characters.
I like that.
So it's not new for me to explore the face, and but this body of work, I feel, and it kind of came I'm always responding to the world around me, my observations, and I feel we are becoming hybridized. We are becoming these other kind of creatures.
So our virtual of ourself in a sense.
And we're attached to technology in a way we have never been before.
Oh, I agree.
And I see those works as portraits of our time. I'm not suggesting that they're avatars or that they're something from the past. For me, they are what we are right now. And
Well, your fascination with technology, or at least according to the movie Koop, was born out of the televised imagery from the first Gulf War. We go back to George H. Bush in this case,
yes,
right?
absolutely.
And that influenced where you are today in a lot of your painting, right? By taking the landscape and then putting in this sort of idea of watching from the outside through another mechanism.
Yeah, well, it was incredible sitting on the couch and watching something get blown up, watching from an aircraft and seeing the sight line and then seeing the target and seeing a poof and realizing that we just saw probably someone being blown up and a building being blown up, and we were watching war on television, so that even the advertising sort of felt like the Gulf War. There was something lining up in front.
I gotcha.
And then I started looking even harder, and I realized that television, because of the digital breakup, the satellite feed and that kind of thing, there would be all this intervention, and then we all of a sudden started to not really see television anymore. We started having all these sort of bands, and we had text and all kinds of information. So now we're reading about 10 things all at one time, and we're preparing for non-television, right? We're preparing for something else. And so the world as I knew it as a young person, I could see it just sort of expanding or becoming something else because of all these other things that were happening. And I started using that in the work in a very deliberate way.
Oh yeah, and it sets your work apart. You know, I think that's where the change really happened. Because I remember the fire paintings, the big, large fire paintings, but they were quite formal in their approach. And then all of a sudden came this here, which is the pared down with the crosses in the sight lines, the cross hairs in a sense. And it is very evident in the piece straight ahead here, the violet one, which sort of has that whole shifting in a sense, right?
Yeah, it could be a monitor, but it actually came out of, started in 2007. I did a body of work called River of Secrets, and it was rolled into my green zone work. But then in 2007, I ended up at a cabin in Riding Mountain National Park, and I was all alone in the bush, no telephone. And I did the Deep Bay robot drawings while I was up there that are in the other room here. But I also started doing a whole series of reflection paintings. And so
is this water reflection, or is this combined with self-reflection maybe?
Well, all of that, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And so it became a metaphor for that experience. And I have continued to do these reflection paintings continuously since then. Smaller, very personal kind of paintings. And so I decided with this body of work, it's the last painting in the series, and it just seemed appropriate to revisit that in a larger piece.
Well, what's interesting too in the show itself here, there's quite a few small pieces, which is took me a bit caught me a bit off guard, because your work has always been about this size, there's a giganticism to your work, right?
I don't see it as that, though. I see it as an intimacy.
What, with the large size?
Yeah, I feel that large paintings allow the viewer to enter into them.
I could see that,
and that has always interested me. I will never paint a painting just to paint a large painting. It has to be physically something that I'm invested in. And if I'm invested in it, in a way, when I'm painting, I paint on the floor. And I choreograph my paintings, so I kind of dance them. And I don't paint a painting that I can't I can't paint, like that physically my body wouldn't allow me to do.
I gotcha.
And so there is that very personal, intimate act that I feel I'm sharing, and that if you give the paintings the time, you enter into something very personal.
Catherine Knight brought it up when I interviewed her about the movie about you, entitled Koop. But in it, she brought up this really interesting point that you felt the studio was an extension of your own self. That your studio was you, in a sense, right?
Well, and also it's like I'm a bit like a mad scientist. And I'm continually absorbing and making notes and drawings and post-it notes and film and video and finding new ways of articulating observation visually. And so the process for me is continually ongoing, and the scale comes through that. I do a lot of smaller works that lead up to another scale, that lead up to another scale, and if I'm still interested after maybe a year of this process, then I know that I need to take it to another level.
Well, you've started to take your work to another level. Like, I think you just did a show a little while ago that incorporated dancers and also video projection and new media work. How did that come about? And well, how did you feel crossing those? Because, you know, when we think of painting, we think of not the installation, but we think of the object itself, right?
Well, I've been doing film and video installation for about 25 years.
Really?
Yes.
Because that's not what I relate to you about.
No, I know, but I've been doing, actually, it started with painting installations, and then in the 90s, early 90s, I was doing a lot of film and video, and I started using that. And I always thought of the video projections as moving paintings, and the paintings as videos, almost like videos, like a still.
Yeah.
And sometimes people would wonder if they were still like photographs of maybe paintings being projected. But because I would hang the paintings away from the wall like screens, so they'd be hanging in the space, and I would project the video on the wall.
I gotcha.
And I did quite a number of works. I just didn't show them here, but I've shown across, in other places in Canada and in Europe. And
well, I gotta say, the space here reminds me of the images I saw of your studio. And so I think it's like so incredibly appropriate for your work. And as you mentioned, this is the first time in Ontario you've actually had a space that really appreciated the work.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
I felt very excited to bring the work here, and I felt at home. Like I finally felt like, yes, this is good. This is good. I like this.
I agree, and the show is stunning. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Wanda's work will be here, the show entitled 1951, until June 15th here at the Division Gallery, 45 Ernest Avenue at Symington and Bloor. Thank you so much.
Thank
this has been
you.
wonderful.
Thanks, Mike. It was
I'm
great
so
to
honored
meet
to
you.
have finally met you.
Thank you.